Thanks for sticking around for the last session today. Hopefully my voice holds up through the rest of this. One down, one to go. So what I'm going to be doing today is, and I have no conflicts of interest, so that makes that easy. I'm going to be talking about the psychology of supplementation, and I'm going to take two approaches to this. The first thing we're going to talk about is really why we see supplement use and sort of what drives the rationale and being aware of what the behaviors are. The second approach is actually going to be talking about the psychology of supplements. In other words, what cognitive, higher brain order effects, what emotional effects do some of these have? And there's 5 in particular that we'll discuss when we do this. So we're going to look at it from a biopsychological standpoint. So we'll get into a little bit of the mechanisms, but overall, we'll try to really just deal with the sort of the main points as we have them. Now, when we look at it overall, first thing to deal with is, let's look at supplements by the numbers. It's pretty remarkable, really. In 2012, the supplement industry was worth $23.5 billion. Not that that doesn't sound impressive enough by itself, but when you realize that in 1994 it was just $4 billion, it gives you an idea of how much it's grown. So we're talking an annual growth of about 5 to 7%. One of the things that's raised concern, though, and I want to make this clear, it's not that the supplement industry is unregulated. It's not tightly regulated. So there are some loopholes in terms of things that people can potentially get away with. And as a matter of fact, in 2004, and this garnered a lot of news, Geyer and colleagues actually did a study. They took 634 different non-hormonal supplements from 215 different suppliers. And what they found was that almost 15% of them contained a substance that would lead to a positive drug test. Now, that also means that 85% didn't. Okay, but when you're dealing with athletes and things like that who might be drug tested, that is a point of concern. There was a recent case where we're seeing this again now, even at the NCAA level, with a player who tested positive for clomiphene, who's claiming that it was in the product that they particularly took. When we start to look at even just college students, over 1/4 of college students do admit to using supplements. Now, the funny thing is, if anybody, and it kind of drives me nuts when people are like, oh, I'm anti-supplement. Look, supplements can be very useful. If you've ever drank Gatorade, you've used a supplement. If you've ever taken a multivitamin, you've used a supplement. Okay, but people get up in arms, oh, supplements are bad for you. No, bad supplements are bad for you. All right, so what we want to talk about is trying to clarify that a little bit. But when we look at college students alone, the main reasons that we see them using supplements are weight loss, energy, muscle building. No big surprise. What about athletes? Between 46 and 74% of athletes have reported using supplements. And again, some of them have used supplements and don't acknowledge they use supplements. What's interesting, though, is they're most common in elite and female athletes in particular. The female athlete growth rate for supplement use is tremendous. You can thank Title IX because it's a more competitive environment. They're looking for edges that we've seen with male athletes for decades. And the catch is, when we start looking at steroid use, the negative side effects are so much more pronounced for females that their ability to use something else is even more useful to them potentially when they look at it. 100% of cyclists reported using supplements. This was actually in the Australia Olympics. And when you survey cyclists, yeah, every one of them. And I'll tell you what, if there was any that said they didn't, they weren't in the Olympics. Okay, so supplements are a reality of what we're dealing with. But the problem is, again, what's the useful information and why do we see this overall happening? So from an industry growth standpoint, overweight and obesity and this pursuit of an ideal body image are certainly driving a huge amount of what we see for supplement use. The other thing, too, is when we see sort of this media portrayal, and that includes social media portrayal, of this ideal body image for males and even females, you're talking about adolescents and adults starting to use supplements to increase muscle size. All right, that's not a big surprise, but it's kind of what we're dealing with. And I still insist, it's funny when we see sort of the media portrayal, I still firmly believe that really the selfie was the death of the credibility of the health and fitness industry. Because what we're seeing now is sort of this make-believe world, and people they want to find a way to strive to get that. Heaven forbid it be through hard work, right? So in a lot of cases with supplements, we're looking for a quick fix. It's not really how they were designed, though, so we have to understand that. The other thing, too, is with drug testing in sport, there's a lot of improvements that have been made, and drug testing in sport is funny because it's very much a cat and a mouse game, right? Athletes have always tried to stay a step or two ahead of the testers, and over the years, it's been this constant back and forth. And so what's happening is we're starting to see this outgrowth of supplement use. It's really funny because actually when you saw the biggest uptick in creatine use was right after the Steroid Control Act of 1991. And part of it was because creatine was fairly new, but the other reason was, wow, if we're banning all these other things, what else can I use that'll give me benefits? All right, so when we start to look at this, gaining that competitive edge is a very real consideration. Now, we can start off by saying very few supplements have a huge effect. Some are pretty good though. All right, and as a matter of fact, when we start talking about performance effects of things like caffeine, we've done a study where we saw as much as a 30% time to fatigue in elite soccer players using a caffeine or caffeine derivative. That's a big deal. But that being said, most supplements offer a small advantage. So people look and go, oh, why bother? Why bother? Well, when your race is won or lost by 1/100th of a second, that small advantage can be a big advantage. All right, so we have to recognize that that competitive edge is something that is worth considering in terms of why we see this. So when we start to look at the motivations to really kind of go after this, we have to be aware of what the specific goals of the supplement use are. Are they doing it for performance? Is it muscle building? Is it weight loss? Is it health? Because the rationale is going to drive different things. And so when we worry, for example, about the health risks of certain supplements, if your goal is winning versus losing, the health may be a very secondary consideration. On the other hand, when we look at non-vitamin, non-mineral use, and we're looking at health benefits, which we'll actually talk about today, then really the health outcomes become very salient. But what we have to realize is, with all this being said, there haven't been a lot of studies that have specifically looked at explaining what the motivations are behind why people do this. The reason this becomes important is if we understand the why, it really does help us from an educational standpoint, because it helps us target what the message needs to be in order to make sure that if people are using supplements, they're using the right ones and they're using them in the right way. And that's going to help us tremendously. I am by no means anti-supplement, but I can't stand up here and tell you I'm for every supplement either. I think there's 5 or 6 that have some pretty good evidence behind them. Short of that, there's some niche markets for different things. But ultimately, what we have to realize is probably one of the most basic explanations behind all this is really behavioralistic. It's reward and social influence. Am I getting something out of it? And what do I perceive my peers are doing, or the people that I want to be like, what are they doing? All right, because that influence is going to have a major contribution in all this. So we've got 3 main theories that kind of drive this. One is operant conditioning. All right, think Pavlov's dog. All right, so this idea. Now, for operant conditioning to explain why we use supplements, the supplement has to work and probably work fairly quickly. All right, there has to be a reward benefit to this for that to be the explanation. So the funny thing is, with the exception of maybe 1 or 2 supplements, this probably isn't the main theory behind why this is occurring. Most supplements take longer to have a benefit than what you get immediately. With carbohydrate, you can see an immediate benefit. With caffeine, you can see an immediate benefit. Most other things take a while to build up. So the operant conditioning side probably doesn't explain all these. What about persuasion and conformity? So now if we look at theory of planned behavior, where social norms and attitudes shape how you conform, well, the interesting thing is on that end, that explains 70% of the variance in the supplement habits of females. So when we start to look at why women use supplements, what they see as a social norm and accepted behavior drives a lot of what they're willing to do. On the male side, it actually looks like it may have more to do with achievement goal theory. This applies well to athletes. In other words, mastery versus ego. If you're in that competitive aspect and it's all about winning for you, that drive to find something that's going to tip the scales in your benefit is going to be a major driving force behind why you choose to do this. The other thing we have to realize is, and it's funny, this whole role of the expert and spokesperson, and some of the people you see promoting supplements, and why do supplement companies spend money on pro athletes as their spokespeople and stuff like that? You know what's funny? I don't know how many of you realize this, but if you look at a lot of the supplements that are promoted by bodybuilders, very few of the bodybuilders actually use the supplements that they're actually paid to endorse. Think about that for a minute. So why do they do it? Because they're getting money to do it. So now people buy it because they go, oh, I want to be like that. Okay, so that expert and things like that is really going a long way. It's so funny. I mean, and you've got to be really careful when we see this, because there are a lot of people, Dr. Oz, probably one of the greatest sellouts in the history of medicine and media. Right? But when he's marketing his own supplements and he's promoting what works on his show, people see that as an expert. This is what they look to. So now they're running out and buying raspberry ketones. Does it work? No, not really. But you tend to believe these people. So we have to be careful with this. The other thing that we tend to do is that people that look like we'd like to look, we go, oh, it must work for them. There's probably a lot of other things going on there too. So when we're looking at the motivations behind why people do this, understanding that there's multi-factors probably driving this helps us from an educational standpoint, because what we need to start doing is providing good information. When you look at it from a body image and eating disorder standpoint, what's interesting is women that are classified as at risk for an eating disorder, so in most cases already exhibit disordered eating, but it may not actually be an eating disorder yet, 65% use diet pills. So they're looking for this adjunct, this additional thing to add in to help them with this. And then from an Adonis complex standpoint, this whole idea of muscle dysmorphia, all right, bigorexia. All right, what we're dealing with here is now, if you look at bodybuilders with muscle dysmorphia, they're more likely to experience body dissatisfaction, social physique anxiety, and because of that, they tend to use muscle building or fat reducing supplements. And it's funny because I've seen a lot of people that want to blame creatine and things like that for steroid use. Oh, it's a gateway supplement. They start with creatine and then they go to testosterone. It's all the same driving motivation. It's to get bigger, to get stronger, and they're treating it like it's a gateway drug, and that's not really how it works, because it's not giving enough due to what the motivations are in the first place and understanding how these theories really fit. So we have to realize that. So as we're going at this, then the next step becomes, okay, if this is why people are potentially using these supplements, and so there's a psychological drive to do this, if we step back and we look at it a different way, we also realize that there's another psychological side to this, which is the biobehavioral side. So in other words, if our behavior influences the supplements we use, can the supplements we use also influence our behaviors? And the answer is actually yes. So we're going to walk through 5 different ones that have actually been shown in some way, shape, or form, or promoted to have psychological ramifications. Now, the funny thing is, when we look at the biobehavioral effects of certain supplements, it actually all started with a little molecule called testosterone. So let's take a step back in history, right? We'll go back to the 1930s. All right, so we're dealing with World War II around this time. And at this time, there were 2 competing labs that developed and found the molecule that they were able to synthesize to create testosterone. One of those happened to be from a Nazi scientist. Both were awarded the Nobel Prize. A lot of people don't realize this. Hitler would not let him accept the Nobel Prize because he was actually pretty pissed off that he gave away their secret to the world. What was interesting, though, is there were 2 times where we first saw, 2 ways, where we first saw testosterone used. People forget there was a huge, this is based in medicine. The first, right around World War II, was the recovery of concentration camp survivors. They found that it helped put back on muscle mass, helped them heal, and helped them recover. The second was a performance aspect, though. Hitler was giving it to his SS soldiers because he found that it helped them sustain longer, but also they were more aggressive. So there's a psychological effect to this. So we start to look at this, and people start to realize, hey, when we start to look at these hormonal responses and things we can give people, there's a psychological outcome to this. One of the areas where we probably see this more than anything is caffeine. How many of you here are coffee fans? I am. I am trying to find a way to get Starbucks to sponsor my lab. I swear to God, if anybody knows anybody, let me know. So the funny thing with caffeine, by definition, is probably the world's most abused substance, right? But coffee and caffeine in general has a lot of really positive parts to what it does. And overall, when we look at the effects cognitively on vigilance and attention, we've seen caffeine studies show that we can improve simple and choice reaction time. So just simple speed of response as well as decision making. Sustained attention and vigilance, your ability to stay focused on a task, and improve decision making. So when we look at this aspect to sport or overall performance, especially when you start thinking tactical performance, that's a huge upside. And what's interesting is it's even more pronounced under sleep deprivation and fatigue conditions. So now when we look at this, there's one area where we could really see this would have benefit. And funny enough, it's one of the best studies that's been done on this. It was SEAL trainees during Hell Week. All right, so this is a pretty large study back in 2002, 68 Navy SEAL trainees. They looked at 100, 200, or 300 milligram doses of caffeine. They had already been sleep deprived for about 72 hours. What they found was that in the 2 groups that received either 200 or 300 milligrams, visual vigilance, choice reaction time, fatigue, signal acquisition, as well as alertness were all improved. All right, so under sleep deprivation, they could respond better. The really cool part was, and this doesn't sound that impressive until you think about it, there were no changes in marksmanship. Oh, it didn't help shooting performance, but it didn't hurt it either. And that was one of the big concerns, was if you're taking caffeine and you're jittery, are you now not able to focus on that target? Turns out it had no ill effects on marksmanship. So they're still able to shoot as well, and they think part of it was because they actually picked up on the signal faster. In other words, they had better target acquisition in that case. So what happens is that target acquisition and detection probably offset any of that unsteadiness. And any of the tasks with sort of less fine motor control, it was more gross motor movement, had even more improved accuracy. We had actually done a study with college fencers, which was just published last year. And we actually found that we went as high as 7 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram, which is like 2 venti Starbucks coffees. It's a lot, right? So it was funny. So we take these college students with sharp, pointy sticks, and we jack them up on caffeine, and then their goal was to hit a target as accurately and as fast as they could. And what was amazing is performance continued to improve up to about 6 milligrams per kilogram, and then there was a rapid downturn. But overall performance, both acquisition, speed, and accuracy, all improved. We're just finishing up a study right now where we're looking at caffeine in soccer players, and we saw an increase in time to fatigue, but also we're looking at cognitive performance at the end of a half and at the end of a game after performing a simulated soccer game on a treadmill. And sure enough, in the higher dosing group, they're able to pick up on the signal with choice reaction time faster. So there are some cognitive benefits here that we have to be aware of. Now, why does it do this? Ultimately, it's because of what it does to arousal. All right, what caffeine is really good at doing is targeting the areas of the brain that really signal for us that we're in focus and that we've got more heightened arousal. The other thing, too, is it targets adenosine receptors. Now, where adenosine also becomes important, though, in an area where we're starting to see caffeine have sort of a new possibility for cognitive benefits, is actually with Parkinson's disease. Because what happens is, in Parkinson's disease, it's characterized by central dopamine deficiency. With adenosine receptors, caffeine has actually had dopamine agonist-like effects. In other words, it simulates and causes an increase in dopamine response. So now with Parkinson's, there's a potential benefit to using caffeine supplementation. Now, in the human trials that have been done, they have been a bit inconsistent. Part of the problem, though, is they're using incredibly high doses because of trying to overshoot this dopamine response. So some of these studies, they were using like 1,000 milligrams of caffeine. In the studies where it was a little lower than that, they tended to have more positive benefits. So again, when we look at the biobehavioral responses to this particular stimulant, there's other areas outside of just sport performance. Now we're in a new health realm here, but it's a common mechanism. It's that adenosine receptor that starts to make the biggest difference here overall. The other thing, too, is what it immediately impacts and where it has an effect is also on the contractile status of the muscle itself. Caffeine doesn't just act through central nervous stimulation, it actually influences the contractile properties of a muscle too, and some of it's through psychomotor coordination. So there's a neuromuscular coordination effect, but it also stimulates the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Some of you might know that as the stress response. So that in and of itself isn't a bad thing, all right? As a matter of fact, most of what my lab studies is the HPA axis, but because of this, caffeine has the ability to stimulate the same response that physical or psychological stress would. Now, in controlled conditions, that's heightened arousal. That's a good thing. The problem is if you have somebody who's at risk for hypertension and they're particularly sensitive to HPA activation, that's something we have to be aware of with caffeine supplementation. All right, in that case, it may be that lower caffeine supplementation may do just enough for them to get these benefits. The same thing also applies, though, if you have an athlete where you're trying to stimulate maximal focus. If they get really nervous before a game, jacking them up on caffeine is probably not your best bet. If they have trouble sleeping, you got to be aware of this. That means they may respond to a slightly lower dose, though. All right, but these are things where, again, the one thing I always stress to any athlete is don't try it for the first time on game day. All right, try this through your training to see how you respond in order to do this. Now, there are some considerations we have to make, though. First of all, time to peak after ingestion. Caffeine peaks at about 60 minutes after you take it in. All right, now it'll sustain for about another hour after that, but be aware of that. So if you've got somebody who's going to run like the 200 or 300 and they take caffeine 5 or 10 minutes before they're going to run the race, it's not at its peak action. All right, so we want to be aware of where you're going to get that sustained effect as well. The other thing, too, is a lot of studies have looked at either absolute or standardized doses. Ideally, we start to look at standardizing, right, per kilogram, basing it on your body weight. The problem is, for a lot of people, that's really difficult to calculate. So more and more, it's not that we want to dismiss the studies where they've looked at 200 or 300 or 400 milligrams. Just realize that the size of the subjects may have influenced the results of that study a little bit. The other thing that can influence is pre-treatment caffeine intake. Now, for the longest time, we really thought that if you're a habitual caffeine user, you don't get the benefits out of it the same way that somebody's novice does. Turns out that's not the case. Even somebody who's a habitual caffeine user still gets benefits, psychological benefits, performance benefits from caffeine. But there was a study that just came out recently where they showed that if you're a low-dose habitual caffeine user, it may actually negate some of those effects. In other words, you screwed up by building up just enough tolerance. All right, but so basically, if you're going to be a habitual user, just use a lot of caffeine. All right, and then you're fine, and then you've wiped out all the problems. All right, so those are some of the things that we're starting to see as well, and even some new derivatives related to caffeine, like theacrine, that actually has a more sustained release response and doesn't show the same habituation. All of these things are things that are coming down the pipeline that we want to be aware of. The other thing, too, is be aware of the skill of interest. If you're looking at speed of reaction and decision-making tasks, caffeine can be very, very useful. But it's not a one-size-fits-all. The other thing that can influence this, there's some really cool genetics work going on whether you're a slow or fast metabolizer of caffeine. In my opinion, a little bit too much has been made of this to this point, because even in the groups that's sort of a mixed genotype for the two, they still get a performance benefit. It's just not quite as big. So generally speaking, for about 75% of the population, caffeine works. For about 50% of the population, it works really well. For about 25%, it screws you up. Okay, so we want to kind of get a feel through training in terms of how this is going to work. But certainly there are most definitely psychological effects to caffeine, and the mechanisms of action are actually really clear. Another thing that actually has cognitive, so we're familiar with creatine because of muscle building and strength properties. What often gets missed when it comes to creatine that I think is one of its most promising aspects are the cognitive effects. When we look at creatine, look, we know there's performance benefits, right? There's a ton of evidence for this. But what's really cool is there's increasing evidence that it helps with brain function and neuroprotection. There is some remarkable stuff going on right now looking at creatine and traumatic brain injury, Huntington's disease, and even basic cognitive function. Okay, and when we start to look at this, look, TBIs are a reality, and they're getting more and more and more attention because of the NFL, because of soldiers coming back from battle with TBIs and things like that. My brother had severe TBI, and it's interesting because starting to use creatine, we're starting to see some of the benefits that had not been there for a while. But you're talking 1.7 to 3.8 million people per year in the US alone suffer from TBI. Sport-related TBI has increased by as much as 60% in the last 10 years. Now, part of that is because we're a little more cognizant and aware of the severity of concussions and what they can do to have. So people, rather than just being like, oh, wow, they got their bell rung, right? They're like, oh, we should probably go get them looked at. All right, concussion protocols have changed and things like that. But the amazing thing is, that being said, there is very little in the way of therapeutic intervention. We keep focusing on ways to make equipment safer, but we haven't come up with a way to help them heal faster when it happens. And it will happen. It's a natural byproduct of a lot of the things that we do. So being able to treat this would be really, really crucial. What we're seeing is one of the misconceptions about TBI in most cases is that it's simply due to cellular damage. In other words, you just squished the brain. What really happens, though, is it's actually energy disruption. When you take this hit, when a TBI occurs, you actually disrupt the cellular network that supplies energy. So your ability to use ATP for fuel in the brain goes down the toilet. So what happens is, when we see this inability to process this, one of the things we're realizing is, okay then, if we could continue to supply ATP to that banged up brain, would it respond differently? Well, guess what creatine does? It provides the phosphate to make more ATP in order to do this. So what we're seeing then is that ATP to ADP ratio and even phosphocreatine to creatine ratio maintenance appears to be really critical for helping reduce the amount of trauma that can actually occur with TBI. So what happens is, look, I'll be the first to tell you, and you can kind of understand why this would be a problem. Doing a TBI study with creatine in humans is not a really easy thing to do, all right, because you have to be able to induce traumatic brain injury. There are not a lot of human subjects protection boards that are going to let you do that, okay? So in most cases with the human studies, we're going to talk about one in a second, it's treating after a TBI has occurred, all right? So you're not in control of severity and things like that. But the work that we can rely on that's shown some interesting results has been done in mouse and rat models. And in those models, so what they'll do, right, so they take these little mice and they smack them over the head with a hammer, essentially. It's like a cartoon thing, right? Like, wow. All right, so can't do that to humans legally. All right, but anyway, so we look at this, and then what they're doing is they're looking at the time to recovery and what happens with this. What they found was that if they gave chronic creatine administration in these mice and rats, there was as much as a 36 to 50% reduction in cortical damage compared to the untreated groups. 36 to 50%. That is huge. So when we look at it, part of it was creatine maintained those cellular ATP levels. The other thing too is creatine is actually a great free radical scavenger. It's an antioxidant. So a lot of the damage that gets built up through free radicals after damage can be reduced with this as well. And so when we start to see this, and even its ability to maintain mitochondrial membranes so that we can produce the energy for the brain to still function, all of these things happen. One of the cooler studies that's been done in humans, this was done over in Australia, and what they actually found is it was 6 months of creatine administration in children that came in with a TBI, okay? They were actually using a pretty high dose, about 0.4 grams per kilogram per day in these kids. What they found was that creatine administration improved the duration of amnesia, all right, so they didn't have that post-concussive amnesia for as long. The period of intubation, so now, for example, they were able to come off respiration sooner, and it decreased their ICU stay, and probably most importantly, it improved linguistic understanding, which apparently I'm struggling with. But ultimately, when they look at this, now here's the other cool thing about this, right? So they showed these benefits in kids, and one of my favorite things is when people go, but supplements haven't been shown to be safe in children. There's no supplement studies in children. Actually, yes there is, and there's a really big one. This is huge. This is a high-dose creatine study in kids that showed no negative kidney function, no negative blood lipid profiles, and all positive outcomes when it relates to TBI. So the next time somebody tells you there's no creatine studies in kids, yeah, there are. All right, and there's actually one besides this one as well. That's pretty good. So when we look at this, the benefits here are something we need to start thinking about. All right, now, in vegetarians, this may have an even bigger effect. All right, because they tend to be creatine deficient. So 5 grams a day for 6 weeks has actually been found to improve speed of processing in vegetarians. And in a repeated serial calculation task, which can be very mentally fatiguing, just a constant math solving problem, it's actually been shown to reduce mental fatigue in general population as well. And a lot of what it did is it impacted oxygen utilization by the brain. Another area where we're starting to see some real promise is with Huntington's disease. So creatine has actually been shown to have a benefit on Huntington's progression. The problem with Huntington's disease, it's a progressive neurodegenerative disease. The problem is there's no effective therapy for it right now. But what creatine appears to do is it helps conserve some of the normal neuronal death that occurs with Huntington's disease. And so what it does, it positively impacts metabolism. I'm not going to tell you and stand up here and say that this stops Huntington's disease, but it does appear to delay the effects. And for somebody suffering from HD, that can be a really big thing. Okay, so there is some promise here in terms of what we're seeing from a neuronal standpoint. So when we look at the mouse model that's been used for this, we see that creatine can enhance the side effects, or reduce the side effects of what we see with HD and delay brain atrophy, and it actually creates new neurons as well. And because of its role as a free radical scavenger, it helps with preventing ATP depletion. Now the catch though is at really high doses of creatine, the benefit goes away. So there's a bit of a curvilinear response where it levels out. So in more moderate doses, that appears to be where we get this. Now, from a human model standpoint, it's been difficult to translate to, but it's also a difficult thing to study. But again, the stage of Huntington's disease will matter in this. The earlier we appear to catch it and use it earlier in treatment, the better the benefit appears to be, as well as the creatine supplement method as well. We're looking at different forms of creatine. Honestly, to this point, it still looks like creatine monohydrate is probably the best bet even from this standpoint. Now, what amazes me, and I'm gonna talk about another one later, is despite the potential benefits on TBI, and let's even say they're potential benefits, they're hard to dismiss. But it's funny because it's one of the supplements that's on the restricted list by the NCAA. As a school, you can't give it to your athletes. And they're worried about cramping. And they're worried about what, you're going to get too much muscle? They talk about muscle tears. There's no evidence for that, and yet there's evidence for psychological benefents. These are things we got to start thinking about from an ethics standpoint. All right, now, another one that becomes interesting is Ginkgo biloba, right? We heard of this one. And it's funny because I remember when I first started looking into this, you're thinking, there's no way this stuff works. But it's funny because ginkgo has been used in Chinese medicine for like 5,000 years. We only really started seeing it show up in the Western medicine in about the 1960s. So what's it claimed to do? Improve mental alertness and focus. And we've even seen it used clinically now for memory impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and even seasonal affective disorder. So what's the deal on it? Does ginkgo really work? Well, funny enough, the more I started looking into this, the meta-analyses have generally found positive benefits for ginkgo biloba on memory impairment, Alzheimer's disease, and dementia. For the general person, ginkgo doesn't do much of anything. For somebody with Alzheimer's disease, especially mild to moderate, there appears to be a benefit. It may not be huge. Now, we do have to worry about publication bias, right? One of the problems we have with research is a lot of times if you find something doesn't work, it never sees the light of day. So there's entirely the possibility that what we're tending to see out there are the positive studies, and there's some inconsistency in methodology as well. But realistically, when we start looking at cognition and dementia, there are some potential positive benefits here that admittedly even surprised me. All right, so from a normal cognitive function standpoint, it's not very compelling. We don't see very much here. But when you start to look at Alzheimer's disease-related dementia, it may actually be clinically relevant. The other thing too is, much like creatine does, it's a free radical scavenger. That's probably one of the ways that it functions the best is as an antioxidant for the brain. So what it does is basically all the damage to brain cells and things like that, it helps prevent that. And so what it's doing is it's a repair mechanism as much as anything else, and it acts as a scavenger to pick up on the crap that we're generating in order to reduce the amount of neurotoxicity that we would normally see. Now, in terms of ginkgo and dementia, if we look at some of the large-scale clinical trials, some of them have been actually fairly positive, and some, we've seen as much as, year-long studies in this. These are pretty hard to pull off, but a year-long clinical trial with mild to moderate dementia did find a reduction in signs and symptoms compared to placebo. But mild dementia appeared to have the biggest benefits. That's not a bad thing. The other thing, too, is when we look at it overall, yeah, ginkgo does appear to have a beneficial effect on Alzheimer's disease and dementia. We do need more randomized clinical trials here, though. There's a catch. I'm not going to give a blanket statement and say, oh, it absolutely works to reduce dementia. No, but there does appear to be a small but clinically significant effect. And if any of you have anybody in your family or have ever experienced anybody with dementia, especially when it first starts, even a mild improvement can make a big difference early on in terms of delaying some of these effects. So it is something that's worth considering when we see this overall, especially if it improves overall functional abilities, which has real potential in that case. Now, another one that's become kind of popular, and it's funny, it's faded by the wayside just a little bit, is St. John's wort. Now, it's actually fairly commonly used by the general population. It's actually one of the most popular supplements. The interesting thing about St. John's wort and what its purported benefit is that it may reduce depression, similarly to antidepressants in some cases. All right, and in some cases, what they're saying is St. John's wort's as good as exercise at reducing depression. The problem is there's some potentially concerning side effects with St. John's wort that we have to be aware of. All right, now, when we look at St. John's wort and mild to moderate depression, most of the larger scaled studies and meta-analyses do show that St. John's wort does have a positive benefit on mild to moderate depression. Severe depression doesn't appear to do much. Okay, but mild to moderate depression, it does. And as a matter of fact, in one of the larger randomized controlled trials, it was actually found to be as good as one of our more common selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, our SSRIs. So it actually worked as well as an antidepressant in that case. Again, mild to moderate depression now. So when we look at it, one of the problems we have is St. John's wort is really comprised of two components, all right? Hyperforin and hypericin. Hyperforin is the main one, but what St. John's wort does is it actually inhibits serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine reuptake. So this helps keep them circulating in the system, which is what a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor does. The other thing too is it'll impact some of your other neurotransmitters, and it appears to have an anti-inflammatory effect. And one of the things that we're seeing with depression, and one of the reasons why exercise appears to have a big benefit on depression, is because it's its ability to re-regulate your inflammatory response. The other thing too is it serves somewhat as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So when you look at some of your MAOIs from an antidepressant standpoint, St. John's wort works relatively similarly. Here's the problem though. So St. John's wort interacts with other drugs pretty profoundly in some cases. Now, as a caveat to this, I should say, so does grapefruit juice. Okay, grapefruit juice can compound the effects of a lot of things, and the reason is they both act through cytochrome P450 enzymes, which are in the liver. So what happens is, if you're on things like warfarin, so if you're on like blood thinners, anticoagulants, HIV protease inhibitors, theophylline, oral contraceptives, this always takes a lot of the female athletes by surprise when they go, wait, what? So yeah, turns out it reduces the effectiveness, all right, because it changes their metabolism. So if somebody's taking other drugs, be aware with St. John's wort, it can change their effectiveness. In some cases, it up-regulates their potency. In other cases, it reduces their effectiveness. And it's hard to judge which way. So it can definitely compound this, but we have to be aware of that. The other thing too is because of the commonality and what it does to the cytochrome P450, the other thing too is if you're on an antidepressant, St. John's wort can change its function. All right, and it can actually make things a lot worse. The other thing too is because what it's going to do is lead to serotonin excess, which now creates a new problem. The other thing too is we have to be aware, because exercise has antidepressant effects, we desperately need trials looking at St. John's wort plus exercise as well, because St. John's wort may exacerbate some of the effects of exercise. So does St. John's wort work for mild to moderate depression? It appears to, at least modestly, but realize that it interacts with a lot of stuff as well. And that creates a potential real dilemma for us going forward. Last one I want to talk about are omega-3s. Now, omega-3s are pretty cool because they do a lot of cool stuff. All right, so we're going to talk about a few different cognitive effects of omega-3s. They have benefits on cognition as well as mood-related issues. Now, DHA, all right, so you got two components of omega-3 that are really important. DHA and EPA. DHA has most of the developmental effects on the brain. Okay, so when we're looking at developing babies and things like that, DHA becomes a really important component here. So it plays a big role in motor neural types of activation and things like that. And so what they found is that, if we go to kind of one of our biggest trials on this, a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, all right, 4 grams of fish oil a day, which seems like quite a bit, but what we'll find is that in most cases, 3 to 5 grams per day is generally what we see as an effective dose, has been found to improve mood, attention, reaction time, and decision-making. All right, so there are definitely cognitive, psychological effects with omega-3s. The other thing too is one of the areas where we're seeing a benefit is with mild Alzheimer's disease. Now we're back to this neurodegradation. We're back to these free radicals and cellular breakdown. Well, one of the things that happens is DHA actually limits amyloid beta. Okay, so when we're looking at that amyloid beta peptide that causes dementia and Alzheimer's disease, omega-3 decreases its overall function. So what happens is, especially if you begin it early in that process and used in conjunction with antioxidants, there appears to be a real benefit to omega-3 and the progression of Alzheimer's disease as well. Another area where we're seeing real promise is with ADHD. Interestingly, from an epidemiological standpoint, one of the things that's fairly consistently seen in kids with ADHD is an abnormal fatty acid status. They tend to have very low levels of omega-3 in their blood. Some of it may be dietary, some of it may be the way they process it. So in other words, they may simply need more fatty acids, especially omega-3 fatty acids, in their diet in order to do this, because we know that omega-3 fatty acid deficiencies are related to behavioral problems and learning difficulties. And so in some of these studies where they've given omega-3s to these kids, we've actually seen that there's an improvement in ADHD symptoms as well as the behaviors. All right, now this it's a bit of a stretch, but given that ADHD and autism share a common allele, that may be another group where future research may show a benefit of omega-3s on behavior as well, because of what they see for commonalities with that. The funny thing is, with some of the studies where they haven't shown that omega-3s were any better than the placebo for improving these, the funny thing is in those studies, olive oil was the placebo. So olive oil itself has huge omega-3 properties. And so what happened is they were also giving them another monounsaturated fatty acid. So in other words, fatty acids help. Regardless of whether it was the omega-3s or the others, this is something that we're starting to realize. All right, the other thing too is, now back to this TBI idea, right? So we started with creatine. Well, with omega-3s, there's some really cool stuff going on in terms of cellular regeneration and cellular energetic maintenance that we see with omega-3s after TBI. So now when we look at this, look, it re-regulates brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It maintains brain plasticity, all right? And what we're seeing is, unlike some of the other things that we've tried to do, there may be even a prophylactic effect to this. In other words, not only does it help with recovery faster, but it actually reduces the initial damage that occurs in the first place. So if you're taking omega-3s, the severity of TBI may not be as high as it would have been otherwise. And so now what happens is structurally, biochemically, behaviorally, cognitively, there's benefits that we see in terms of recovery from TBI. In some of the animal studies that have been done, in one study in particular, recovery after TBI was back to the uninjured animal status after 30 days of supplements with omega-3s. 1 month. If you know anybody or if any of you have suffered from a concussion, you know that in many cases 1 month is nothing, because this can go on a lot longer than that. So to be able to get back to this level is really important. Now, the problem is human data is generally lacking. Why? Again, it's a hard study to do. It's a hard study to do because it's not like we're going to induce TBI. What's frustrating to me, and we're going back to the creatine issue, creatine's on the restricted list for NCAA in terms of what you can or can't give your athletes. As of this year, so are omega-3s. You cannot give your athletes fish oil. So two things that have been shown to improve response to TBI, maybe even prophylactically, let alone recovery-wise, we can now no longer supply. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So these are things we need to start thinking about. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean you can't recommend omega-3s to your athletes. They can take it, schools just can't give it to them. All right, but we need to start thinking about this long-term in terms of what we're driving from this. So when we look at TBI, look, we get acute axon loss, we get an inflammatory response, there's excess glutamate that forms in the brain, and then oxidative stress is a huge part of this. What do omega-3s do? They actually help combat every one of these four things. They help with axonal regeneration, they help provide neuroprotectins, they reduce inflammation, they reduce glutamate cytotoxicity, they enhance antioxidant activity. All of these negative effects that go along with this brain damage from a TBI is actually reduced with omega-3s. So there's a huge benefit there. And even when we start to look at mental health benefits, omega-3s have actually been shown to play a big role in reducing depression. Now, funny enough, unlike the brain structure part, which is mostly driven by the DHA part of omega-3s, EPA appears to be the part that drives the antidepressant effects. And there's some really cool benefits in this. And so when we start to see this, even mild and moderate depression has responded. Major depression, sort of. That's a little bit harder to treat. But even mild to moderate, and a lot of it probably has to do with the inflammatory cascade that we see here. And so ultimately, look, if they were also suffering from anxiety disorder, it doesn't seem to work as well. There's a lot more going on from a stress-related disorder standpoint. But if it's mostly depression-related, there is a benefit here. And it's even in 2 studies been shown to improve bipolar depression. So again, what we're starting to see with the brain function part of this and re-regulating the whole system, we're starting to see a benefit to what omega-3s can really do. And how we administer it may be equally important. We're starting to see that if it's attached to phosphatidylserine, if it's via krill oil and things like that, the delivery gets a little bit better to the brain simply because of the way it can target it because of the phospholipid bilayers. And so now, most of this has been done in ADHD and PMS. All right, so we don't have a lot of this evidence with depression yet. But again, when we start to look at what's going on in the literature, this is an encouraging area. So why does it do it? Look, it modifies inflammation, it modifies neurotransmitters, it reduces oxidative stress, it enhances structures. There's better, bigger, more developed axons. So when we start to look at this, yes, there are psychological, biobehavioral mechanisms that these supplements are starting to see benefits for overall. And what's funny is if you start to think about this then, if we start to group this and we look at these benefits on the brain, now combine it with exercise or combine it with creatine, and you're starting to see a multimodal approach to dealing with some of these psychological outcomes. because now we're looking at things that synergistically start to work together. So again, I'd be hard-pressed not to recommend this. I'm not saying it's going to cure everything. We shouldn't go that direction. But in terms of its prophylactic effects and what it may do from a benefit standpoint, this is something we want to take into account. You'd be hard-pressed to think of a negative reason for not using this when all is said and done. So in conclusion, our reasons for supplement use are probably multi-layered. Everything from who we're relying on for what we're competing for and why we're doing this and what our motivations are. We do know that education is important. We need to separate the good from the bad, what works, what doesn't, and how does it work, so that we understand what we're getting ourselves into, and trying to target some of the more regulated supplements, things with informed choice, with NSF certification and things like that. There are biobehavioral benefits to caffeine, to creatine, Ginkgo, St. John's wort, and omega-3 fatty acids. The biological plausibility is strong. The mechanisms make sense. Dose response is still needed though. How much works best? What's optimum? All right, with some of these, with creatine, we know it's roughly 3 to 5 grams in most cases. All right, same thing we would use for performance benefits appears to be the brain benefit. When we start to look at omega-3s, 3 to 5 grams per day. You could probably go as high as 6 with some of the studies that we've seen. But we need larger scale studies. This is our job. This is what we need to do a better job of. All right, but we do need to start considering interactions. Some of these interactions may be really good. Right, so we might see that creatine and omega-3s work together. Others, with St. John's wort and some other things, may not be good. But identifying these so people have better information is a critical part of what we need to do. One thing I want to do really quickly is I want to acknowledge all this work was based on a chapter that I wrote with one of my best friends from grad school, Ray Lutz, who passed away in 2012 from mucosal melanoma. He was the chair at Baylor University. And every time I give this talk, it's great for me because I feel like I'm kind of honoring Rafer with this. So I appreciate you guys sitting in here. It was actually the last big project that he and I worked on together, and I just continue to update this for revisions to the chapter. But, you know, for me, it's a big deal, and so thank you for sitting through this, and I'd be happy to take any questions related to this, and by all means, feel free to reach out to me after, too. Thank you guys very much.